All right, welcome everyone to today's LSAC meeting. Tim Bobrowski, chairman today, and I'd ask for a roll call, please, at this time. Miss Leslie Slaughter, who is going to be our new head of our group here, because she's going to keep everybody moving smoothly here. So, Leslie, if you don't mind, do a roll call, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Absolutely. Danny Adkins.
Danny Adkins, present.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, present.
Tim Bobrowski.
Tim Bobrowski, present.
Harry Burchett.
Harry Burchett, present.
Tom Cochran. David Cox.
David Cox, present.
Keith Hale.
Keith Hale, present.
Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, present.
David Raleigh.
David Raleigh, present.
Kelly Ransdell.
Kelly Ransdell, present.
Russ Tilford. All right, I'll come back to Tom Cochran.
Leslie, I'm texting with Tom. He's on the road traveling and he's trying to get on remotely on his phone, but is having some difficulty. So
Okay,
he just
we'll
asked me to
work with
let you know that.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll work with him to get him into the meeting. And Russ Tilford, one last check on Russ. All right, Mr. Chair, you do have a quorum.
All right, well, let's go ahead and address the one item on the agenda today, and that's the regulations for the second reading in action, which would be the amendments to 703 KAR 5:270, the Kentucky's Accountability System, which is a second reading. And we have Ms. Rhonda Sims, Jennifer Stafford, and Mr. Kevin Hill with us today.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody and be with you. And we do need to take action today because we'll move this forward to the board. And we've been out with groups in the time since our last meeting. So we have a little bit of feedback to share with you from SCAC. And I think you received in your binder a summary of several other groups that we had been with, such as Parents Advisory, Teachers Advisory. So you may want to access that at some point. You probably have looked through that in the binder Ms. Fields sent to you. We thought it might be helpful, Chair, if you want us to kind of go back through a couple of the details of the regulation. If you would like to do that, I will tell you that as a kind of a starting point today, the only two areas that continue to kind of get some differing opinions coming forth are the minimum end discussion, what should the number be for a reported group, and accountability, and a little bit of conversation around weighting. There was a SCAC put forth a different recommendation on weighting. Those are really the two issues that have really drawn sort of any feedback beyond I'm sort of okay with it. So in summary, and we'll highlight that as we go along. But is that kind of how you see it going, Superintendent Borowski?
From the comments that I've heard and concerned, I think so. But before we do, if it's okay, we do need to make sure that video transmission is occurring, just so that we're in compliance with our Open Meetings Act. So I would ask all of our members to at least have their video going and streaming so that we are in compliance as a group.
Sounds great.
Let's give them just a second until we can get them there.
Sure, we will. I think you've got someone in the lobby waiting too. I think I saw that pop up in chat.
I mean, more blinders. Okay. All righty. So it looks like we're getting our LSAC members. Again, Leslie, I'll let you, I can see one screen in front of me, but I'll let you kind of make that determination as to who needs to turn their video on, please.
Superintendent Bobrowski, I think you should be good to go. Some folks, it won't pop up on the video feed that we see until they actually speak. So
Okay.
I think you're good to go ahead.
All right, sounds great.
Okay, Tim, are you ready for us to start?
I think whenever you're ready, we're ready.
Okay, and I have, again, Jennifer and Kevin with me, Jennifer Stafford and Kevin Hill. And so they'll be weighing in, I'm sure, as we go along. How we take this kind of a bit in sections, we'll go through, just as a reminder, what are some other topics that have been talked about. But I think most of our conversation will be today around those two issues that are still a bit outstanding, to get your views on that. But obviously, on anything that you want to bring up, please do so. I will remind you too, in your binder, there's about a 5 or 6 page summary of all the changes, including really just the non-substantive text changes. The new legislation refers to things a little differently than the prior legislation, so we've made all of that align, and you can see a nice side-by-side with what are the changes and the reason for them. And that starts on about page 28 of that binder that was sent to you as a PDF, just for your reference. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Andy and others, let us know if you're seeing that okay. And let me get the PowerPoint up. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now?
Not yet, Rhonda.
Okay.
Let's see, I still don't see it. Do you think
Want to
you're?
try it again?
Yeah.
Let's try it
And
again.
Rhonda, I've got it if you need me to.
Okay. Jennifer, if you want to try it, we tested it before and it popped up, but before the meeting started. But let's give it one more try here and see if it goes.
It's there.
Okay, great. All right. So obviously just our opening to remind us the day. Remember that we're really talking in terms of the board on 3 tracks. This is the first track, the alignment of the accountability regulation with the most recent statutory changes from last legislative session. And then in addition to that, we'll begin some discussions on assessment and assessment design. And so the board will begin to talk about those. We've had some introductory times as well. And I think as we start talking about those changes that are part of that third track approach, where we really talk about a future assessment design, obviously this group will be very involved in those conversations, as well as an engagement across the state for what people would like to see assessments do in the future, and how to support really a broader conversation of what should education look like in the state of Kentucky. So as we move forward, just to the summary of the changes, as I mentioned, you have a nice summary that Michael Hackworth developed in our office, our policy advisor, that indicates all the changes that have been made in the reg and the justification reason behind those. Most are in alignment to statutory language and a clarity around dual credit collection data for using courses instead of hours. But what we're really at change for are these 4 areas that are outlined on the 3rd bullet. And the first one on status and change and how that fits together. The statute outlines the need for color coding and color reporting, similar to the California model. And part of that is then how you combine status and change together. And of course, change comes around in the 2nd year of the system and status in the 1st year. And that does not fit inside the regulation itself, but we thought it was an important piece to discuss with folks as we went through the regulation, but it will sit inside our consolidated state plan. weighting and the combining performance, that one has had some separate recommendations, at least a separate one from SCAC that we'll talk about in just a minute. English learner progress and taking advantage of any flexibility available for students that are older when they enter our Kentucky U.S. schools. Also, students that have interrupted schooling. All of that it has been well received. Everyone wants to take, obviously, advantage of any federal flexibility for this population that has a lot of challenge. And so we have, I think we can clearly say move forward with that unless someone in the group had a concern with it. And then obviously a lot of discussion on the minimum end, what we've had and what we have proposed that was fairly in alignment with what was discussed in the last legislative session. And then there is a change in Section 5. We had spelled out a how to set long-term goals, and really those are reporting only requirements. And we have referenced those to be in the state consolidated plan because they will have to have a negotiation and federal approval. So that's just a reminder of the various components. And status and change, you remember, uses the 5x5 colored table. And this is an example of one with change on the top, status on the side, and how you put together your current year, which is status, and your change is current year compared to the prior year. Now, LSAC will be involved in actually determining what is the numeric cut, what is the number that would move you from one box to another. And that would be after we would do a standard setting process, and then LSAC would have some approval of those cuts. So this is really a conceptual look at the color table for reporting and how status and change combined. And so I want to move us to a side-by-side. We had a recommended, this is the recommended one, and you will see the real difference between the recommended, that is the one that has received all the positive comments when we've been in front of groups, is the level where it says medium in the current year on the left side. And you will see that there are two yellow boxes, or excuse me, two orange boxes, a yellow and two greens, depending on if you've declined, if you declined significantly, if you maintained, if you increased, or you increased significantly. So the recommended has more definition, more color options on that medium row. The alternative model that was shared with the board and has been out with our various meetings with groups is this version, where the medium, you can see, does not have as much definition. There's only one orange and one green, and much of that row is yellow, where it says medium in the current year on the left side of status. So this is the two side by side. And you can see, if you look again at the third row of the actual blocks is where you see the difference. So as we've been in front of groups, the reaction that we've received has consistently been to stay with the recommended version, which is on the left. So I'm going to pause there. And of course, Jennifer and I, we would be doing this a little differently if we were side by side, so we could kind of see each other. But Jennifer, I'll pause there to see what you might like to add, because you, our members of your team, were out with some of our groups in conversation.
So thank you, Rhonda, and good morning, everyone. The recommended this 5x5 grid has received all the support. We've not received any support toward the alternative. One aspect, as we've discussed with our multiple groups that we've been talking with, is how this color coding plays into the accountability system. And I'll just remind everyone that this is a reporting feature. So the numbers behind the tables, which Rhonda alluded to, that will be set in conjunction with the local superintendent advisory council, are those that play into the accountability, and then the weights that we'll talk about bringing together into an index system. But for this piece, these color-coded tables, these are reporting aspects, so that it's very easy to understand and get a quick glimpse of the performance on each indicator, because there will be a different color-coded grid for each of the different indicators. There'll be a different one for separate academic state assessment results in reading and math, state assessment results in science, social studies, and writing, post-secondary readiness, quality of school climate and safety, graduation rate, and then the English learner progress. There'll be separate individual grids for each of those indicators that will be reported by.
And that is one reason that, it's because the actual place of number where you would move from one of these boxes to the other does vary based on the what measure you're in there. For example, graduation rates are quite high in the state. So how those would divide out across this kind of grid would look a little different than something like a proficiency level, which is not as high overall. But you still would have that developing it out. Also, you remember that in statute, it does talk about that we would use percentiles as these cuts are being determined. And so there would be a process, again, to sort of indicate, when do you move from box yellow to box green? What is the cut point and the data behind that? So let me pause there, Chairman, and see if anyone has any questions or comments around this particular piece. Again, you do not see this sitting inside the regulation, but rather it would be in the consolidated state plan as we explain the system and go through the federal approval process. But clearly the statute says we will develop this kind of grid system. It doesn't use the term grid, but the 5 colors and the description is what this would lead to.
Great, thank you, Ms. Sims, for the presentation, and Ms. Stafford. I would ask the body if there are any questions or concerns or anything that you all may have as a group or as an individual.
Rhonda, this is David Raleigh with LaRue County. So, of those groups that were consulted, when you said that people kept coming back to the recommended chart, were all those groups, like the Teachers Advisory Council and School Curriculum, those folks were in agreement as well?
Yes,
That's
okay.
correct.
That's correct. There was no, and again, I think the full listing of the group is in the staff note that is part of that packet. We did meet, I'll see if we can recall them, and Jennifer, you may need to help me. We met with Parent Advisory, Teachers Advisory, I think maybe, do we have local school boards?
We had the CAKE board. We worked
the CAKE board, DAC, our DAC advisory. Obviously, the DACs are very immersed in this.
And SCAC.
And SCAC. Now, SCAC is not listed in the staff note because the staff note was done before SCAC met. They met last week, but they were also in agreement with the recommended. I think what we heard is the reasoning behind that is they like the ability for a little more definition in the medium row, that you're not just primarily yellow. If you look at the alternative, you can be medium in the current year in your performance. You can have declined from the prior year and you would be a yellow. You have maintained from the prior year and you would be a yellow. And you have increased from the prior year and you would be a yellow. But yet, if you look at the recommended, if I'm medium in the current year and I declined from the prior year, I'm orange. Declined from the significantly. If I declined, I'm orange. If I maintained, I'm yellow. If I increase, I'm green. If I significantly increase, I'm green. So you have a little bit more option for the green coloring in that row and a little less dependence on that yellow block. And obviously, in the reporting, these labels will need to go along with the color because you can have a particular color with more than one combination of labels. And that is just a factor of this type of accountability design. that again is very similar to California's, and it's what is spelled out in statute, in Kentucky statute.
David, we also met with the Parent Advisory Committee. So we've met with the teachers, we've met with principals and parent advisory. So all of those groups did support the recommended table.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the explanation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Rhonda, I have a question. This is Sheila Mitchell from Anderson.
Yes, Sheila.
Has there been any discussion, or what has the discussion been around decline? Is there a range for declined and or increased from prior year? Has that been defined yet?
No, that has not been defined yet. So what you would actually do, and I'll have Jennifer and Kevin join me here, but I'll take the first shot at this. You would actually have a standard setting process. So first of all, we need to see what the data looks like from whatever particular years we're working on, the first year that you would set your standards. And we would look at a percentile as to where would be the number behind the cuts, and you would be able to see what the impact would be if I move the line slightly one direction or other. And then that would produce a set of cuts that then would come to LSAC and KDE for approval. So until you actually have the numbers and go through that process, you don't know exactly what that numerical cut will be, but we do know it will be a percentile cut because it requires that in statute. And there's also, the goal is to you set the cut and you leave that cut in place as long as you can. So after the first year, ideally, the first year you're able to do status and change, which is really kind of the second year of a system. You should be able to have that cut locked into place. But there would be the process of this group of LSAC also looking at those cuts. We would probably do a formal standard setting process and then bring the cuts to LSAC. And I would assume we'd have some members of LSAC as part of the process as well for you to review. So Kevin or Jennifer, anything you might add to that description or alter in that description?
No, that was a really good description and overview. The couple points that I would add is that it'll be a very public, transparent process where lots of educators will come in and look at the various data that is related to each of the indicators. So it's not going to be just one decline, but it'll be the decline or the amount of increase along that row for each of the different indicators. So all of the data for each of the indicators will be reviewed individually. So the state assessment results for reading and math will be reviewed, and then the state assessment results in science, social studies, and writing, that'll be reviewed, so that each of the different indicators will have their own range, if you will.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jennifer. And I think a classic place you'd see that would be something like graduation rate. Mm-hmm. Overall, we have a very high graduation rate in Kentucky. So how that distributes along a percentile, if you imagine, the old-fashioned bell curve really is this kind of percentile look, but how it distributes and where you would put the cuts, those numbers will look a little different for something really high performing like graduation rate compared to something where you have a much wider range of performance, like maybe how we do in reading and math. But it'll be grounded in what the data is, the actual results.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Sims,
I think we're ready to.
Any discussions? Are you ready to move forward?
We can. Again, we just wanted to bring that back to you. So then the next step here is combining the performance. So remember, we look at combining status and change using the 5x5 grid. Once we get all of the detail out of status and change where it's combined, then we need to think about how do you put it all together in order to help identify the bottom 5%, as well as sort of an overall performance look for a district. And you will already have combine status and change. So you no longer look at status and change when you look at the overall. But we do, we had a recommendation coming out of some discussion earlier from the board to use a color rating system for the overall performance as well when we put together elementary, middle, and high school performance. And again, it would use that same scale from red at the lowest level to that kind of a bright blue at the upper level. And then obviously we will have some labels of words as well as color, because we do have people who have color blindness, and to be make sure our accessibility is good on the web. We will have the name of the color as well in that reporting. Again, this is about the reporting, but also then pulling it all together for that final designation. So that happens because we apply weights to the various pieces, and this is very similar to what we have done since the very early 90s in Kentucky, which is to form sort of an index by putting together the pieces and putting a weight into the pieces. And you will see that what we have in front of you on slide 10 is the proposed weights that we took to the board and brought to you with the first reading. There are some things that are somewhat limited in how we can move them. So I'll remind you that federally, we have to have the greatest emphasis on reading and mathematics. And we also consider an English learner progress is also one that they like to see some amount of weight on as a separate indicator. Then the graduation rate and combined with the reading and math must be at least 51% at high school. So you will see at high school, we have a 45 on reading and math and a 6 on graduation rate. And that brings you up to 51. So if those numbers are tweaked in some way, you would have to keep them in balance. For example, if you made the state assessment results 41, then you would need at the same time to increase graduation rate to 10. So you have to keep those in balance, because federally, they will look for at least 51% of the weight coming from those two things. Weighting, this is where we differ a little bit from the California model. California had a pure profile approach, which we did 1 year in Kentucky, where we did not apply weights. But you do have to demonstrate an actual weight in operation to the federal level. And that was a challenge for California. They were able to get approval of their plan and demonstrate it, but the end result was they had to identify 8% of their schools at the bottom instead of 5. And so the weighting being in our statute makes it a little modified from the California plan, but allows us to demonstrate federally that we're meeting the expectations on weighting of the components of the system or the parts. So this again is what we brought forward. The board had a couple of suggestions for us initially. One was to separate out elementary from middle and not have those combined together. So you'll see there are 3 rows and not 2. The board also was interested in trying to have the science, social studies, and writing to have a bit more weight. And we were certainly able to do that a bit better at elementary and middle than at high school. At high school, we really have very little place that we can alter the results or the weights, and that would be particularly between the assessment results for science, social studies, writing, and post-secondary readiness. So this is what we brought forth to the various groups and to you previously. I know we've had one alternate proposal from SCAC, and I'm going to pause. Jennifer, do we have any other change that came up as a recommendation other than the recommendation from SCAC?
Not formally at this time.
Okay. And I'm sure we may, receive a few more letters. I would not be surprised, when this goes out to public review, we may have comments around that as well. Really, weighting is a way to put some of your value and what you kind of, the percentage of how you value, but we can't do it totally as a valuing exercise because we do have these federal requirements that have to be met around that, particularly at high school, having reading and math plus graduation being at least 51%. The recommendation from SCAC involved the second column and the fifth column, the relationship between state assessment results and post-secondary readiness. We do, I believe, have, I know obviously Leslie is on, who works in the Office of Career Technical Education, and we may have others from our colleagues in that office, because I think this is one you'll want to talk about. The recommendation from SCAC was to increase the 20 under science, social studies, and writing, and reduce the 20 to post-secondary readiness. So what they proposed was 30 for science, social studies, and writing, which then would leave 10 for post-secondary readiness. And I know this group has talked quite a bit about post-secondary readiness opportunities in the past. So we want to put that on the table for you to react to. Obviously, it will flow to the board as part of the communication from SCAC that they've made that recommendation. They weighed in on other things, but this was the only place where I think they made a formal motion. Jennifer will correct me if I was wrong there.
You're correct. That was the only place with the weights that was a formal recommendation and supported by all the members.
Right. So, Tim, I think this is one you definitely will want to talk about. You can talk about whether or not how you feel about what the initial proposal is. You may have something to counter there. That's what you see on the screen. And then again, what SCAC has brought up as a motion was the idea of increasing the content-based weights of science, social studies, and writing, and reducing the post-secondary readiness weights.
Well, I think probably first, Rhonda, let's talk about it with our group here to see what kind of issues or discussions that our LSAC members may have, and I'll start with them and see what issues that they have, and then we can discuss it further. So we'll open the floor up for that.
Chair Bobrowski, Danny Atkins, Floyd County. I think as superintendents that is the major focus of our duties, I think, to our students is to increase our post-secondary readiness, whether it be college or career ready. And I would be hard to understand a weight of post-secondary readiness.
Thank you, Danny, for your comment. Comments from others?
This is Keith Hale from Glasgow. Of course, I have a vocational background, but I do understand the recommendation, and but I agree with the previous comment. I think our focus should be maintained on post-secondary readiness, maybe cleaned up a little bit as we move forward, because there is several games that's played. But I think if we take that focus off, we'll see schools maybe lose programs as we move forward and some of those things.
Thank you, Keith. Others?
Chair Bobrowski, is Harry Birch at Harrison County. I too would agree with Superintendent Atkins and Superintendent Cox. It's hard to understand without more explanation from that group the thought process for reducing post-secondary readiness when the change in the world that we face and what's ahead of us. We really need to be expanding in those opportunities in those areas, and I don't want to reduce any opportunities for our students.
This is David Raleigh with LaRue County. I would just echo the sentiments of the previous superintendents. In our strategic plan that we recently was approved by the board, what we refer to as transition readiness, which is pretty much the same thing as post-secondary readiness. We place lots of emphasis on that, from the time we get kids as preschoolers until they exit our high school. So as we place a lot of emphasis on that locally, I would like to see the Kentucky Board of Education kind of follow suit on that.
Hey, Tim, this is Dave Cox. I have a question for Rhonda. Can you hear me, Rhonda?
Yes, I can, David.
English learner progress, 5% across the board. Is that a mandate, or is that just a number that was arrived at based on recommendation, or is that something, that number, is it set in stone? And let me tell you where I'm coming from, and certainly not to be supportive of diversity and all those type of things, because we certainly are, but let's say that you're in a district that has a relatively or a very small population that fall under that category. To mandate that be 5%, that's a fourth of what science, social studies, and writing is worth. To me, is there some type of sliding scale perhaps that could be utilized there based on the percentage of kids that fall into that category in your district, that English learner progress would be adjusted to that number? And that may be maybe muddying the waters way too much, but it seems like it's a one size fits all kind of thing that doesn't really fit all.
Yes. And, that's a very good point, David. And, in the prior system, we did have really the equivalent of a sliding scale, because if you had an English learner student, they contributed to growth for English learners, and they contributed to growth for reading and math. So they were in there twice if you had a student, and at the high school level, they were in the transition readiness measure, which was the previous title for post-secondary. And so we embedded them, and in essence, what that created was that sliding scale. I will tell you, we got a lot of conversation with our federal contacts over that. They really kind of expect to see something that looks like this chart. Federally, they expect a very clear definition of weights. Now, the 5, we sort of just really kind of looked at, all the other requirements for weights and conversations, and recommended a 5 moving forward. Now, but one thing to keep in mind, this plays into the minimum in discussion a little bit. If you don't have a group, some schools will not have a group of English language learners to report. So what happens is that 5% would be proportionally redistributed to the other parts of the system. And we've done that for years. We sometimes have schools with missing a grade level, and the weights of that grade get redistributed proportionally to what is remaining. So there will be cases in Kentucky of less diverse schools that have few English learners, that 5% really will be redistributed across the other portions of this chart, but at a proportional level.
But again, Rhonda, the minimum in number that you're talking about is not necessarily a sliding scale either. It's a very finite number. It's not based on the number that you have in your district. So you could have a very small number of kids that dictate 5% of your overall accountability index. And to me, that I don't know. It seems like, and I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but it seems like we try to fix that every year. And it ends up being a throw in at the end. That's just 5%. But in reality, 5% makes a difference, especially when. And I'm a social studies guy. I understand Keith's point. I'm also a vocational guy too. So I strongly support what he and Danny said. But from a social studies standpoint, I think I would agree that 20% weight for science, social studies, writing combined needs to be increased as well. And I just,
Okay. Well, and one of the things I guess I'll say on the English learner piece, I really think we're in a position we have to have a weight. I don't think we don't really have a way to embed English learners like we did previously because we don't have growth, individual student growth. And so I think we'll have to have a weight. Now, I don't think we have any federal rule that says it must be 5%, but you do have to have a weight that would be acceptable federally. They don't say it must be at a certain, that they don't say it has to be at least 5, but I don't think we could get away with like 1 or 2.
Right. No, I understand. And listen,
so I think there's not a lot of room there to move, that because of the number.
And
so,
you folks are doing great work. I don't mean to sound.
No.
Opportunity to answer the questions that will be. To answer questions that will be asked of me, and everybody's demographics are different, and so all these things apply differently to each of us. But for the record, and then I'll turn my microphone off. I do agree with Keith and Harry and Danny. I think that post-secondary readiness should be the main focus when we get to that point.
Sure. I will, someone, and I'm not sure which superintendent asked this, so forgive me for that. Someone mentioned not knowing the thinking of SCAC as they made their recommendation. I'll take a stab at just what I thought I heard that day from SCAC. And then, but I'm not, please don't think I'm trying to convert your thinking. I just wanted to respond to that question. SCAC, I think, looked at, obviously they'd like to see a really more truly equal weighting of reading, math, science, social studies, and writing. But federally, it's almost impossible to get to a true equal weighting because they do expect more weight on reading and math. So in their discussion around that weighting of the 5, one of the comments that was made is they felt like if students got a strong grounding in all 5 subjects, that they were in essence more likely to be post-secondary ready. So they were considering the performance in the 5 content areas and how we measure those in a content area test to be an indicator of post-secondary readiness. They talked in terms of that rather than talking about those external measures as what we include in post-secondary readiness, things that federally they refer to as student success measures, like AP, dual credit, advanced placement, as well as the career technical side. So that was kind of their conversation around that. And I'll pause, see if any of my team would add anything differently. And that's just to give you a sense of where their thinking was as they made that recommendation. Again, not, please don't take that in any way that I'm pushing the conversation in any direction. That will be your all's strong perceptions there and experiences. Jennifer, did you think I captured that okay, or was there anything you would add to that?
No, the only other comment that I think that I heard on SCAC was the fact that they, in addition to the state assessment results in science, social studies, and writing being a reflection of post-secondary, because they thought if a student was showing success in reading, math, science, social studies, and writing, then that would be reflected over in the post-secondary readiness measures. The other comment that I heard was that they think that the weight of 20 at high school is just not enough, that they have more, they wanted more value shown toward those content area assessments. So that would be the only additional comment. But David, I wanted to go back to your question about the English learner progress too, is the reason that we have the English learner progress as a standalone indicator now is because of the changes that were made to the statute through Senate Bill 158. So where we had previously in the previous system, as Rhonda mentioned, it embedded with growth and post-secondary readiness that did indeed have that sliding scale. The reason that it's brought out as a standalone indicator is because that's what the bill did, is it pulled it out as an exclusive list, and it was included in that exclusive list of indicators of the accountability system.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's a good clarification on that. And that was a much more articulate explanation than when I talked about we no longer had growth to embed it in. But, we had tried to do that. Well, we had done a more sliding scale when we had a little more flexibility in the listing of indicators and were able to embed it in growth and in transition readiness. So I think I've heard a few things, Tim, and we may want to get the reaction. I feel like I hear pretty clearly from the group, at least those that have spoken, that they do not wish to follow the SCAC recommendation or push that forward as an LSAC recommendation. And then I think the other thing is whether or not you have any suggestions as a group around the weights as they're recommended here. And certainly, Dave brought up English learner progress at 5. We might be able to take that down slightly, but I think we will get a federal pushback if we get it probably much below the 4 of school quality and safety, because they do expect it to have some significant level of weight. So that would, that I can't speak to exactly will we have any issue with it, but obviously we would negotiate that federally if we did. But I don't think you could take it down very much. And so let's kind of see what your thinking is on this as you think about this whole regulation moving forward to the board.
Well, as you can see, Rhonda and everyone there in her office have done a really good job explaining it, and I think the superintendents have all kind of gave their perspective on the accountability weights as presented. So, Rhonda, are you asking for, like, do you want
Well,
this
I think
motion or just continue?
I just want to make sure that as we're moving through all of the regulation, we get to the point of your thinking and what you want to move forward and recommend to the board. That coming from your opinion, that if there is something different here, we capture it. I do believe, I can't see my screen since I'm presenting the PowerPoint, but someone texted me and said the commissioner, I believe, has his hand up.
He does.
Do you see that, Tim? So
he's there,
okay.
and he just
I
texted
can't
me.
see your hands or anything.
Commissioner Glass will welcome you to our meeting today and ask for your input and suggestions, as well as any comments. So welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief. Just a thought on the process that you're going through. What comes to mind is this, as I've watched this conversation play out here, but also in other groups as the state board has wrestled with it, and actually as we've wrestled with it internally at the department as well. The phrase that comes to mind is opposing, but also mutually positive values. And I think that is reflected in the struggle that all of the groups and the LSAC has with trying to determine what the right numbers are here, because a person could look at any one of these categories and make a strong and compelling argument about why it should be lifted up and prioritized ahead of something else. And no one is wrong. So this is really an exercise in trying to determine in your professional but also subjective judgment, what should the right mixture be for the state. And I will tell you, Mr. Chair, that whatever the committee decides, you will simultaneously be right and you will be wrong at the same time, because this is a values determination and it will depend on the lens and the perspective and the subjective judgment of the person reviewing it as to whether or not the weightings on this were right or wrong. So I say that and put forth that phrase again of opposing but also mutually positive values as maybe a way to think about the decision that is before you as you reach a determination around what your recommendation is to the state board.
Thank you, Commissioner Glass. We appreciate your comments. And again, we all can probably agree on one thing, the decision to when to start back to school, how to start back to school, and all those other fun things we get to deal with. We're well versed at this point of where we're at, but I do appreciate your positive input there to try to guide us as we move forward. So.
Okay. Any other comment or question or concern? Anybody want to get anything on the table around the proposed weights you see on 10, slide 10?
I would just ask, I know, Rhonda, what you're needing is you're needing probably to see numbers based on recommendations. So I would probably, it sounds like high school appears to be the biggest issue here. So superintendents of LSAC, I would ask for any input now so that we collectively as a whole agree upon things so that we can move forward with this particular item. So if you have any questions, and we'll start on the very right-hand side, the graduation rate. Are your thoughts and feelings to leave it as is or as presented, or do you want to do something different there? Hearing no comment, let's move to post-secondary readiness. The proposal is 20. Do you want to change that number, or do you want to leave it as is? Moving on to quality of school climate and safety. Leave it as is. Any changes?
This is Sheila Mitchell from Anderson. Rhonda, is this category one that is mandated at that percentage, or what is the range for the percentage recommendation for that category?
It's mandated that we have that category in state law. So it's part of the exclusive list in Senate Bill 158. And, there's been lots of debate over the last several years of what should be safety measures, what should be climate measures. At a federal level, you're to do school quality and student success measures. But most of our student success measures fit under post-secondary in the state of Kentucky. So we do have to have the category, whether or not it's 4%. That is something we proposed from that was carried forward from the prior system because it is using a survey. We've done one administration of the survey. You've gotten some feedback at district, but we have not used it in any accountability setting at this point. So the 4 is really just carrying forward what was in the previous system. But the 4 is not mandated, but the category is mandated.
Okay, so if it were lowered just a slight bit, that could be some additional movement there if that's something that the committee wanted to consider. Do you think the English learner progress, the lowest acceptable number or percentage for the federal system would be 5% or no lower than 4%? Is that what you indicated?
I would think so. I think we would get a real pushback. We might get a pushback dropping below 5. There's nothing in federal statute that says it has to be particular weight, but it uses terms like it should be a significant weight.
Okay, thank you.
This is Kelly Ransdell. I haven't shared during the meeting, just been listening to the presentation and the conversations, and just will share that I am okay with the weights as presented.
Yeah.
Okay. All righty, and as we move forward, as we cut across the rest of them, we have state assessment results, science, social studies, and writing at 20. Any discussion, any comments or recommendations to leave it as is, as well as the state assessment results, reading and math at 45. Just want to give each person an opportunity to express their concerns on each one of the items before we move on. Hearing no comment, it sounds and appears to be that we have spoken, I guess, in some type of frame of mind, but we have moved I would basically just ask for a motion to approve these proposed overall accountability weights from a member of the body.
Kelly Ransdale, motion.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Anybody else?
David Raleigh, I second the motion.
Thank you, David. We have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion? Any concerns? Okay. Sounds like we have a motion on the table to accept the proposed overall accountability weights as presented.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let's move forward to the next. This was a slide that just shows how they were in the past versus currently. And obviously the big difference in the past was we had growth, individual student growth, and that no longer exists in the system. So that had to be redistributed. So that's why you see a pretty significant shift there. Those were just there for reference. Now, this is the other topic that has continued to have conversation. I will, I guess, pause and ask, I don't believe that anyone will have any objection to us seeking as much flexibility as possible on the English learners and their inclusion. So if someone does have a concern of rejection, be sure that we share that today before we end. But we'll move right on to the one that continues to have quite a bit of conversation, and that's the minimum N. And the proposal is the idea of a school level report. And remember, many schools are only a single level. So you're a K-5 or K-6, or you're an elementary, you're a middle school, or you're a high school. We do have some K-8s, and they're reported as 2, as an elementary and middle. And but we report by school level. And for clarity, we just usually refer to it as school. But to kind of put our balance more on reliability of data and a little less on inclusion in some aspects, we recommended that the minimum N be a 30 per school, or what we would call school level, but we would continue to report publicly in the school report card anything that is at a 10 or above per grade. And previously we had been as a 10 per grade. And Jennifer, I want to see if you'd like to maybe lead our conversation through this piece. You've been a little more experienced with that. I think we have some examples on the next slide.
Sure. Thank you, Rhonda. The reason we bring the discussion about the appropriate inclusion and reliability through the minimum N into the conversation is because of a amendment that we saw proposed during the general session in 2020. So at that time, when Senate Bill 158 was going through the approval process, there was an amendment proposed to increase the minimum N to 30 per school or level, as Rhonda mentioned. That amendment did not make it into the final version of Senate Bill 158 that was passed and ultimately signed into law. But so with the fact that there was that amendment, we brought it forward as a conversation so that we could have educational discourse and have people talk about it and work through the changes as they were proposed in the amendment. So with the accountability system, there's one way through the minimum N to look at reliability. And there's a balance here between inclusion and reliability and simplicity. So when you think about reliability, the more students that you have contributed to the scores, the more reliable it is. The inclusion, as you go through and look at the different configurations of your schools, it will have an impact on the amount of student demographic groups that are included into the accountability system and therefore accountable to that school. So there's this balance between what's reliable and then the inclusionary aspect of the accountability system. And then we also get to the simplicity of understanding the accountability system, how each student demographic group contributes to the overall accountability system. And especially the minimum N impacts the identification of our targeted support and improvement schools and additional targeted and support and improvement schools. Because when you identify TSI and ATSI, you're comparing the student demographic group to the performance of that bottom 5% of schools. So identifying and having this minimum N becomes very important when you're looking at identification of TSI and ATSI. So with that, we wanted to bring forward for conversation and input on the minimum N before we saw a possible amendment to the statute in any upcoming session. So we've again recommended this minimum N of 30 based on more reliability into the system, and so that we can move forward. Keeping the balance again with the transparency of reporting at 10 for our different student demographic groups within the school report card by level. So Rhonda, are you on the slide? If you would move to.
I'm on 15. You want to go to 16, which is it's the schools with the 3, 4, 5?
Yeah, that's good. So looking at the different schools and the configurations, the inclusion of each of the indicators of the student demographic groups will be dependent on the configuration of the school. So in this example that Rhonda has on the slide, shows that this is for reading and math for grades 3 through 5, and it's an example of where the school would and would not be included in accountability based on the minimum N count. So that if the school as a whole exceeds that total of 30 students, it would be included in accountability. And if it did not exceed that, then the student demographic group or the indicator would not be included into that accountability for the school. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions about how the change would impact the accountability or identification of student groups.
And Jennifer, I'll mention, we also shared after our last time with you at LSAC, you had asked for some information on grade configurations and how this played out with the number of groups and reporting. So our data team led by Kevin Hill created an impact paper for you. And I think that was also resent again in your binder. I think it starts on about page 32 of the binder. But Kevin Hill is on with us if you have particular questions around particular grade configurations, because we do have a variety. And I think that's the challenge, to go back to the commissioner's comments. There's not a single right, correct answer here. It plays out a bit differently for different grade levels and different configurations, but the simplicity of a single N is obviously very desirable. And so we'll just pause there, and Jennifer's done a nice overview for you to see what your thinking is, your comments. And we can share. I don't think we had any motion formally made by any group on minimum N, but Jennifer, most groups were supportive of the 30, weren't they?
They were. We did not get any formal recommendation to change from our recommended N count.
Okay.
So yes.
Okay. So back to you, Chairman Browski, to see how you'd like to do your conversation on this one.
Well, I think it's important that we listen to our superintendents of LSAC now. We appreciate, again, you ladies for doing such an elegant job of providing this information. And I'll open the floor to start a discussion about N count, what it looks like. Is that what this group wants to come out and make a recommendation for, or are there other options that may be out there? So I'll open the floor for discussion points from any superintendent that wants to join in.
Chair Bobrowski, this is Tom Cochran, Johnson County. Jennifer and Rhonda, thank you again for presenting. Just a couple of questions. I know, Rhonda, I've aggravated you to death, not meant to.
No, you've not.
It seems at some point, and I may be completely incorrect on this, it seems at some point, though, over the past years, that the federal guidelines requirement did not, maybe the end count was greater than that 10 that we've always used per grade level. Am I wrong in that, or are there any other options other than the end count of 10 or end count of 30 per school? That those two options we have.
No, the federal rule is more around the school. So the federal rule is 30. That if you, and when I say that, if you can recommend 30, you can put forward 30 and not have your plan questioned. That's kind of a minimum floor federally. For instance, if we put forward 100, we'd be just told flat out no. And but it's not, Kentucky's done a per grade level 10, but federally their conversation and the rule of 30 has been around the school as it's a reported unit. We have had that breakdown of 10 per grade. So there's nowhere that I'm aware of in federal rules that said you could raise it to like 20 per grade. Because if you did that, that would basically be 60 for a 3-grade school, or it would be 80 for a 4-grade school, if I got my math right. So it's my understanding, and I'll kind of pause here and let Kevin Hill, who's more of our data guru in my shop, see if, and we've gone back as we've heard comments and talked to our psychometric folks as well that have more experience with working with multiple states. But it's our understanding that the 30 is a school level rule federally, and Kentucky has been lower than that because we've done a 10.
Douglas County Schools paid close to $1 million to a private company called Ingenuity.
And Rhonda, I'll jump in just on that whole issue.
And discovered it not only
part of that is the 30, federally the rule is around a school. As we looked at other states, we haven't seen any other states that's doing a grade end count like Kentucky has in the past. So what happens, because schools have different grade configurations, that varies on the counts that are included in a school, because federally the rule is about school accountability, the whole school. What is a minimum size to hold the school accountable for these groups? So that really is the issue we run into. As you look at 30, we're talking 30 for the school, and as you saw from that example, can vary the count by grade, can even fall below 10, but we're looking at the count by school. So I think that's aligning with the federal expectations. And part of the issue by having different configurations in our past model with 10 per grade, you even had some schools that were given up to 40. So if you're a K-6 school, you'd have a minimum in of 40, which is even above what's federally allowed. So that's part of the issue. We're trying to make this standardized where it's 30 per school by level. So everything's by level in Kentucky.
We've never been slapped for that, that went above 30, but I do think, if it came up in an audit situation, we could be recommended not to allow that. So we're just not sure if we'd get that reaction, but it did follow our rule of 10 per grade. So, but we're, again, not aware. And we've looked at a national document that I think it's been updated maybe last in 2019. And it seems that nearly all states use 30 and 10 per reporting. I don't think there are many that use 10 for the accountability at a grade.
Rhonda, as I reviewed that one, the 10 per grade for accountability, there are a handful of states,
Just
probably 15 or so. It's a mixed bag. Some have 10 for accountability, have 10 per grade. Another, larger portion have 20 to 25. Then there's another smaller portion that have 30. So it's a mixed bag across the states.
Any other superintendents have discussions or questions about the recommended end count for per school or per student group?
This is Harry Burchett. I just have a question for Rhonda or Kevin. Are you aware, or were there any other states that, rather than using a hard to find number, that you rather use a percentage of student population in any areas for that?
No, and that's
No.
one of the federal requirements is in count. It's a minimum in size per school. So it's back to what is a sufficient size, and every state has, that's why we have these discussions, what's important to that state for a minimum size to hold schools accountable. And we've got that whole idea of reliability versus transparency and what's fair. And that's part of the concern with our previous model, 10 per grade. High schools were probably unfairly identified on 10 students because of the assessments, the way they were set up. And so they were being held accountable for 10 students. And that's really a lot of the pushback we've had over the years, while elementaries might have 30 or even up to 40 for a K-6 school. So that's our issue. And hopefully this would standardize it more to, we're taking the maximum flexibility federally we're allowed.
Yeah, and Harry, that's a really good point. And we've even brought that up and kind of looked at it with our psychometric folks, because at a fairness level, the idea, and this goes back to something Dave said earlier about the ELs, an idea to be able to set things as a percentage of what your circumstance is. That strikes most of us as really the probably most fair thing to do, but it's not something that's permittable within the federal law.
Sure,
but we did actually look into that with, again, some of our national psychometric people.
Well, sure. And just thinking of it in terms of the variance in the size of our schools, be it elementary, middle, or high level, elementary, we've got elementaries that are 150 students, or maybe some less than that, and some that are 500 or 600 students.
That's right.
And high schools ranging from, 100 or more to
right.
2,000. So, I mean,
right.
when you talk about that in terms of a hard number by school level, that's a big difference.
It is.
So.
And it's a big frustration. And I think it's where we see that typically when we have a federal law, be it NCLB or now Every Student Succeeds Act, they're many times written for a much more typically large system, something like an urban Chicago. They're typically written with a more national, mindset that it doesn't necessarily fit everything as well when you have small rural school systems. And I think around the country, people have that same experience. But as we've looked at, nationally what people are done, we know that we will be expected to have a straightforward number and not a percentage. We would be told to fix that.
Sure. Really appreciate the research and that data paper that you produced and put out for us. That was very, very beneficial.
Thank you. Kevin and his team did a really thorough job on it, and Jennifer and her crew, I think, helped massage the wording on it. So they did a great job. Wonderful people I work with.
And again, I would go back in as just one of the folks that you just mentioned, small rural areas. I'm gravely concerned about the number because I see more of an equity issue than I do anything else. Just simply because of what Harry mentioned. If I'm a small school district and I have a very small number of kids, and if it's 30 kids, right? And then I'm a large school district and it's still 30 kids, I struggle with that. And I struggle with that just because ethically and morally, I'm saying that's not fair for us. We're almost being penalized because we're that small. And I'm trying to figure out a way to redeem that without having to go through the federal guidelines, because I don't want to see us get to a point where we follow the guidelines from the feds that, like you said, basically are designing this stuff for large urban school districts, and then everybody in Kentucky getting negatively impacted, especially if you're of that category. So that would be my question, would be, is there a way that Kentucky could stand out and stand ahead and represent versus basically succumbing to the federal guidelines? Because we've learned this in the past just from food service, right? Food service put out a bunch of federal guidelines and all this, and then you saw what had to happen when we tried to do anything at all that was different. that just made more sense for us to do it locally. But then we had the federal guidelines directing traffic, and it wasn't good for us. So
Right.
I'll put my comments out there and leave them as they be, but that's just how
Sure.
Tim's world is in small rural Eastern Kentucky.
Sure, Tim. I appreciate that. I believe, again, I got another text. I think, does the commissioner have his hand up again?
I can't see, so I really don't know.
Yeah, I think Teams is a challenge. Commissioner, do you have your hand up for comment?
I do not.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Tim, having gone through some negotiations over the last few years, we've had so many changes. We've negotiated very often with the federal level. My gut reaction is we probably won't move this because it's such a standardized thing across all the states. If we had a lot of states pushing to change it to a percentage, or I really don't even know that the federal law would permit the percentage. That's really a legal issue we'd have to have someone to look into, because I think it's very specific to a count, which is a single number. But having done the negotiating process, I will say that the staff have been helpful to us during that process, but there are some, hard, fast lines that they have drawn that they really will not move off of. And to get your federal approval of your plan, you will need to adjust the plan. And of course, the end result is, without an approved plan, we do not have the flow of federal dollars. And that's the real, carrot and stick approach. You have to have an approved plan that has gone through that negotiation in order for all your title dollars to flow to the state. So I think it's something worthy to keep in mind. We have some opportunities to push some issues. Kevin and Jennifer both are involved with some national groups through CCSSO where data is discussed and policy is discussed. So we certainly don't mind at all pushing that issue forward, even asking the question about it when we get to the point of talking about the plan. I would just be cautionary. I would really doubt that if we put it into regulation and the federal level said, no, we won't go for that, then we would have to do what the federal level requires to get our plan approved, and then we'd have to come back and change the regulation. But we certainly, I understand your viewpoint. I'm a girl from rural Kentucky as well, so some more central part of the state, but rural community. So I understand the point, and I do think many times the federal laws are set up for very large. Initially, when the thinking of the law is designed, it's also thinking a lot about the large areas. And I think that, that is a real concern and a legitimate concern. But my gut reaction is we would not be able to push them off the end count. It is such a standardized piece.
Well, I'll tell you my opinion, and I'll hush. So my opinion is I think that if the LSAC superintendents are kind of in agreement on that point, in fact, is that something, and I know we're the kind of the next to final stop on this, but if we could maybe push some type of a recommendation for language of that, so that we can continue to explore this as an option to use percentages, I think then it would be kind of well documented that, the LSAC group feels this way, but we also understand that federal guidelines may be restricting to some, but at least whenever the plans are submitted, they could see that there is a concern that is there, as well as to the Kentucky Board of Education. I think even from some of those folks that, you may have a couple superintendents on there that may understand it a little bit differently than others. That would be, I guess, about as good as we could probably do today.
And we could certainly push forward a conversation with the feds, or even a communication, and ask for some feedback on it as well.
Yeah, Commissioner, is that okay? Or give me your thoughts on, are we overstepping our bounds, or from your perspective, is that something that you feel like the conversation is worth having?
Well, I think, Tim, the purpose of this group is to make recommendations to the department and to the state board. So you're free to make any recommendations that you want to. I do think that it seems that the resistance to the 30 is premised on a statement that this N size of 30 is built around urban school districts. So my question is really, as we carry this forward into conversations with the state board or with the federal government to argue that point, can you restate what the argument is, or why the N size of 30 doesn't make sense for Kentucky, just so I understand it clearly?
Well, I'm going to defer to my friend Dave Cox, who does a really good job, and Harry Burchett and those kind of folks, and David Raleigh and guys like that have been around that know this game. Guys, let's put together maybe a statement to help the commissioner better understand our perspective. Harry, do you want to start us off?
I will try to take a stab at it from my perspective.
Okay.
So across this state, we have various groups of various proportional sizes, and they vary from community to community, obviously. One group that we have in common, all of us have in common, is our special needs or exceptional needs student population. And if you look at the percentages in each district across the state, that varies from district to district. But when you use a hard count number for school level, we have school population sizes ranging from, and I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I know there's elementary schools with 150 or less students. And elementary schools with 600 or more students. And so when you apply either 10 per grade level or 30 per school level, that disproportionately advantages a larger population school or a smaller population school over another. It either advantages or disadvantages. The same thing would hold true at the high school level or middle school level. And then when you start thinking about some of the other subgroups, certainly a Bowling Green area or I-65, I-75 corridor area has much more variance in demographics and the student populations they are serving than some other rural areas. So the numbers, by using a hard count number, there's no way to provide an equity or an equitable access or definition for in terms of what we're doing here today, unless you use a percentage of population based on an overall average of population statewide. So that's just my thought process or my perspective on it. I could be completely wrong, and after you look at the numbers, it's kind of like ADM, ADA, the discussion we had the other day with you. When you start digging deeper, we might find there may be some other issue. There's always going to be winners and losers. I'm just trying to think of it in terms of what is the most equitable application of the law across all students and all schools and all districts across the state of Kentucky. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Anyone else want to add to that? Because I think that kind of summed it up from what our conversations has been, is it does appear to be somewhat of an equitable issue based on size of your schools from what we're talking about and gathering. So Commissioner, hopefully that gets kind of the clarity that you were looking for.
So yes, I think that what we can do as a takeaway from this is ask the question of the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, around some sort of percentage model and see what their answer is, and then we can bring that back and share it with you, so we can keep the conversation going, and get some of the technical feedback from them on if such a model would be allowable and what they see as the strengths and weaknesses of that approach might be.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if no other discussion, I guess we're ready to continue our conversation, Ms. Sims.
Sure. Actually, that was our last topic. So I guess I would ask for clarification. You know, we can reach out, as the commissioner said, to the U.S. Department of Ed and ask for their interpretation of a percentage model. And, you know, have our legal office look a little bit at the federal law. I guess I would ask whether or not there is a preference on the 10 per grade or 30 holistically, if we should be told no federally.
Rhonda, just one caveat to that. I think
Sure.
in the last time, maybe the last time we met, or maybe the time before, I kind of lose track. You'd mentioned possibly a 10 or 10 or 30 formula. I don't know if there was any more discussion about that.
We had one group, I believe, that proposed the idea of 30 per grade or 10 per grade or 30 for the school. And I'll look to Jennifer and Kevin to see if I captured that correctly. That was not part of a formal recommendation, but that was a suggestion, I think maybe from the prior SCAC meeting, not the most recent one.
Well, for me personally, in absence of the possibility, obviously we're going to be constrained by federal guidelines.
Sure.
In absence of any kind of a review of a possibility of a percentage-based formula, I think a 10 or 30 probably would better meet the needs of more districts across the state. I don't know if that creates other problems for us as a state, but if 10 or 30 is an option, that might satisfy groups.
Okay.
Question. If it's a 10 or 30, by what standard would we apply if 10 or 30 is to be used for the N size calculation?
And I'm trying to think, Kevin or Jennifer, help me out. Was it an and statement or an or statement?
We looked at the and, I mean, the or.
And that you had to have 10 per grade.
Right.
And 30. And so that is if you use the and statement, I think that was what was recommended. So I apologize if I used the or. Then, Commissioner, you would apply, you'd look first at, do you meet the 10 per grade? And then you would apply the and you had 30 when you look at the school as a whole.
And yes, thank you. I'm sorry, Commissioner, thank you for clarifying that.
And so that option was considered previously, and the department staff have not moved that forward as a recommendation. What was the rationale behind that?
I think we were a little bit concerned about the federal example that Kevin, do you remember we talked about that a little bit with our psychometric folks? And we can certainly go back and look at it again.
Yeah, we can look at that. We narrowed it down to the final option of just 30 because, I don't know if there's not a right answer here, but I think it was better what we could get easily approved that would make sense to meet the majority of schools. I think that's where we landed. But we can go back and look at that.
We can apply the and see what a difference it would make. And I think if we're going to reach out to the federal level around the idea of the weight, the idea of a percentage, then we can certainly bring up the and as well.
I just like to jump in real quick, Rhonda, while we're on this
please
discussion.
do.
And as I look at what I've seen on federal guidance and rules around in size, and really the intent, my take of the intent, I'm not a lawyer, but the intent I think is about what is a minimum size. It's not to be responsible for a group in accountability, and that's really what it comes down to. And that's why we come back to 30 as a school as a whole. Regardless of the size of the school. I mean, 30 students is a good number of students to be accountable for. In the past, we've had 10 students accountable for many large high schools, and that was part of the issue we had. So that's why we're trying to balance this measure. So just coming back to that.
I have a question. I mean, as we look at the amendments to this reg. We're looking at, this is the third thing we've looked at, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've looked at the changes and the rationale for those changes. We've looked at the weights, and now we've looked at the end count. So I'm assuming at the end of this thing that we've got to make a recommendation whether we approve this amendment. Is it possible to approve two of those things that we've discussed without the third one? Does that make sense? What I'm asking here? I mean, is the end goal here to get this whole what you presented today approved? I'm just concerned about pulling something out and delaying that and that kind of thing.
Well, here was my thought, is that we have one agenda item on the agenda for today. And what we could do is at the end of this, we're kind of as we move and progress, we're kind of taking these big ideas and just kind of putting out like a general motion to approve. But really the final say would come in the very end when we put the actions with the amendments that the LSAC would like. And I think we could do it very easily by each one of those categories. At the very end, after our discussions here, is then come in and say, LSAC accepts this with this recommendation. They don't accept this, whatever, and kind of move forward with it. And Commissioner, I'll ask for any input there on that thought, because we really hadn't discussed that today, because there's three entities with that. Does that sound like it's a feasible way to move this from LSAC to the Kentucky Board of Education?
Yes. Well, I think what you should strive for is a clear motion that is voted on by this group around that creates clarity for the department on what the LSAC's recommendations are. Because you're making a recommendation to the state board on what they should do.
Right.
So I think on the three elements that we heard about today, there's a broad agreement around two of them. There's still questions around this. So I'm going to defer to Rhonda and her staff around the implications of delaying the end count further, or another option would be for the LSAC to approve the 30 end count, which is what is here, which is what is recommended by the department staff. Go ahead and approve that as a recommendation to the state board, with the caveat that we will seek clarification on these other calculations that were discussed, that include the percentage model or the 30 and then 10 model that were put forth as alternatives.
Okay, that sounds fine. Does that sound fair to everyone that's in the LSAC group? That way you can see kind of the end result here, Rhonda, with your team as well as the superintendents. Does that sound okay?
To me, that sounds fair as a recommendation, what the commissioner just stated.
Okay.
So to be clear, what I would advise, and again, you're an independent body, so you can take or not take my advice on what I think you should do. You exist to be independent of the department, so take it or leave it. What I've got to say, I would suggest that based on the conversation that we've had so far, you recommend the approval of all three of these, with the caveat that the department go back and seek clarity around these alternative methods on the end count, and then bring that back to the LSAC for future conversation, understanding that the state board can revise its regulations in the future if it wants to, presuming that's an acceptable change with the federal government.
All right, is everybody okay with that? I think we'll go ahead and proceed and move forward. So, Rhonda, you say you have no other comments or questions about
right, unless the group had something else they wish to bring up. You had that very thorough summary of all the changes, all the little language changes, but these were the big issues that we started with the board, and so that took us to the end of the PowerPoint.
Okay. Very good. So according to our agenda, it does look like we're to that point. We've had a lot of good discussion. I really appreciate, of course, the commissioner and all the folks at KDE for their input and their hard work as they're answering questions, as well as trying to be transparent with the process as what we are. And I really appreciate you all listening to what superintendents are saying, that everybody wants to have a fair and equitable accountability system, but sometimes there are restraints to that. But I think now with the equity that's of such an issue, you know, it's almost like somebody's got to stand up and try to lead others in that direction, because sometimes folks just aren't asked. And until they're asked, they don't really know. People will sit back, and it's like asking your teachers, what do you want to do about school, right? If they don't give you input and you don't listen to their input, you know, they're going to feel like that nobody's listening. And I want to thank you all today for at least giving superintendents who has this on top of their plates to deal with, to give some input from this body. So thank you all for that.
Absolutely. We appreciate the good conversation, and we're more than happy to move forward the questions to the U.S. Department of Ed, and let's see what we get back.
Well, let's go ahead and do this, and I'll move on putting this out there. The going back to the regulations for the second reading and action, amendments to 703 KAR 5:270 under the Kentucky Accountability System, which is the second reading. We have 3 parts. Okay, so Rhonda, the first part that we discussed was
the chart, and that's really sits outside the regs. So I think we got a good sense of that you're okay with that layout for reporting.
Okay. All right, so that's the one section today that we discussed.
Right. And then you discussed the weights, and you recommended to go with the recommendation that was in the proposal from the department that kept post-secondary at 20.
Okay.
And then the minimum in, which was 30, but with the caveat to seek whether we could have the option of using a percentage to determine minimum reporting, or to look at 10 and 30 combined.
Okay. Now, I couldn't say it any better than what Ms. Sims just did. So you all know me. You know that she always does a really good job with her expression. So that would be the takeaway. And I would probably, at this point, we have 3 subcomponents of this, but I think we're looking at chart, weight, and the minimum in count. And we could look at all 3, or we could just put them all 3 out there and vote on them. I need some help from our superintendent group here. What's your flavor here today?
I'm fine with including all that in one motion along with the caveat that we've discussed.
Okay. David, you good with that? Raleigh?
David Raleigh, yes, I am good with that. If somebody could, for me, because I take notes to share out with Craig, if somebody could encapsulate that motion for me, just so I can keep our folks informed, I would appreciate it very much.
All right, so here's Miss Rhonda. I'm going to ask you to put this out like you just said one more time.
Okay, now I'll try.
I think you did it the best.
Okay, you're putting the pressure on now to do it at the second time.
You got big shoulders.
Okay, that with the specific areas that we have discussed today, that the group recommends going forward with the recommended reporting 5x5 chart, that for the weights, support the recommended weights from the department, and for the minimum in, to move forward with the in of 30, but with exploration with the U.S. Department of Education to look at whether a minimum in could be a percentage of the school population, or could 10 per grade and 30 at the school level be applied as the minimum in.
Okay.
And both of those would require federal feedback.
Okay. And I hate to be too pushy, Rhonda, but really and honestly, I think from what I'm gathering is it's almost like a preference. If we could define a preference for there, I know we're asking, could we do it?
Right.
But at the same time, that really doesn't, in my opinion.
Yeah,
stand-
no, we could say, and the preference from our superintendents would be to establish minimum end by using a percentage of population.
I like that a lot better.
Right.
And I'm assuming the rest of our members do as well. So,
and we can express that with the U.S. Department of Ed in that way, and we'll just have to see what reaction we get.
and then you would also kind of use that in the same language as you move this towards the Kentucky Board of Education. Is
Sure.
that correct?
That's right. When we talk about your feedback with LSAC, and I think Jennifer and I've already talked about putting a slide or two together that would capture that. So I think we'll be having that motion on a slide as well.
Okay.
To communicate with the board.
All right. We have a motion on the floor by, we would need to have a motion on the floor by our members. So I would like to have a motion to accept what Ms. Sims has stated.
Mr. Chair, Todd Allen has, as a courtesy, put together a draft motion for you.
Ah.
So in chat.
Nice.
And that assumes, if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like the only variation that LSAC has come up with beyond the recommendation of the department is related to that minimum end count, if I'm correct.
Correct. Nice job, Todd, on that.
Yes.
Well done.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Todd.
Okay. So we have that motion. We need a motion from a body member. So who wants to make that this morning?
Chair Bobrisky, this is Harry Burchett. I'd make a motion that we approve the regulation as recommended by KDE with a recommendation to the Kentucky Department of Education and Kentucky Board of Education to explore a minimum end count flexibility with U.S. Department of Ed to use a percentage of population or the rule of 10 and 30.
Thank you, Harry. We need a second, please.
Chair Bobrowski, this is David Raleigh with LaRue County. I would like to second that motion, please.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion? All right, we need to have a roll call vote, please.
Yes, sir. Danny Adkins?
Looks like Danny got kicked out. We're letting him back in.
All right, we'll proceed down the line and come back to Danny as he gets in. Kirk Biggerstaff?
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski?
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett?
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran?
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox?
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale? Keith Hale?
Can you hear me? Keith Hale, yes.
Yes, thank you. Sheila Mitchell?
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh?
David Raleigh, yes.
Ransdale?
Kelly Ransdale, yes.
And we'll come back to Danny Adkins.
I think Danny was attempting to get in and he didn't make it. So we have a clear yes vote. Mr. Chair, I think we can wait on Danny trying again or move forward without his vote.
Let's give him just a little bit longer to see if he can get on, please.
Hey, Chair, Danny's trying to get back in. His device died, and I think he tried to jump back on and was unable to.
Okay. So we do have a quorum of yes votes on this. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All righty. Okay. According to our agenda, questions and answers is item 2. I don't really see any other questions and answers, but I guess we'll now move to an adjournment motion. So I will entertain a motion.
Chair, this is Tom Cochran. I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Tom.
This is David. I'll make a motion to adjourn, or second, rather, I'm sorry.
All right, thank you, David. Enjoyed our conversation. Everyone have a good week. I would ask just briefly, Commissioner, if I can use just a second of people's time here for superintendents. I just kind of need to ask a general question. I wonder if I could use this time just to say, how's it going in your schools, to give me some idea as our board meets Thursday night. Is it okay that I use this time, Commissioner? Just to get a little feedback?
Mr. Chair, you are the chair, so you preside over the meeting.
Okay. Give me some thoughts. Dave, I'm going to just kind of go around the horn here. Dave, how's it going?
Tim, I think Todd Allen posted up that did you do the formal adjournment?
We did.
Okay.
So,
We had
Chair
a-
Babowski,
you had a motion and a second, and so you can.
We need a roll call to vote for adjournment. Okay, I'm sorry.
we do.
All right, Ms. Slaughter, go ahead.
All right, Danny Atkins, I think maybe he was able to get back in.
Yes, I was. My device had died. I apologize for that. Yes, Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
I think he left.
okay, Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
and Kelly Ransdale. Kelly Ransdale, she may have already logged off.
Okay.